Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to So Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a viscose in this gorgeous border print design. Really loved this fabric. And I only have a small amount of this fabric, so I'm not able to pattern match all of this dress, but what I am trying to pattern match is specific points in the dress, so namely those red lines you see me point to here. So I just cut each of my bodice pieces on one layer of fabric, laid that cut piece on top of some fresh fabric and tried to match up as best as I could. So this is all of my bodice pieces front and back, and my skirt pieces front and back. As I mentioned, this border print is super lightweight, quite see-through, so I'm lining this entire dress. So I've cut all of the same pieces out in this lining fabric, which is a viscose foil. Again, super lightweight, super drapey, and will add just the right amount of opaqueness to this dress. So that's all of my cutting out complete. So now on to some construction. So this is my front and back bodice. And what I want to do first is stay stitch those necklines. So this is my back. I'm starting at the top of the V, just within my 1 centimeter seam allowance, using a tiny little stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end. And what this will do is just stop that neckline from stretching out too much as I'm pulling this dress together. And of course I've done the same on the other side, so you can see that here. And now I'm ready to stitch up that center back seam. So just placing one back over the other, right sides together, pinning that center back seam and ready to sew. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So off camera, I'll give that a little bit of a press and finish off those edges, so you can see that here. So I'm setting the back to the side for a second to work on the front. So back to that stay stitching again. So exactly the same thing here as I did on the back. A tiny little stitch length starting at the top of the V and up to the shoulder. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that's that done. So now I want to create some shaping in the bodice. So to do that, I'm going to gather up a little bit of this bottom curve. So I have a couple of notches here and I'm running 2 lines of gathering stitches between those notches. So back stitching at the first notch, using the longest stitch length on my machine and just pulling my threads once I get to the second notch. So that's my first line of gathering stitches sewn. And for the second, I'll just move my needle a little bit further to the right, back stitch again at that first notch, and run a line of stitches parallel to that first line. Once I get to the second notch, pulling my threads. So that's my gathering stitches in place. So I'm going to leave the threads that are underneath as they are, and I'm just going to hold on to the top 2 threads and push that fabric along those threads. And here I'm just lining up my waist piece with my bodice to make sure I've gathered enough, and looks like I have, so tying off those threads. And off camera I'll give those gathers a little bit of a press, which I've went ahead and done here, and of course I've done exactly the same on the other side. So now I'm ready to join my front with my back at the shoulder seams. So just laying my back over my front, right sides together, and pinning those shoulder seams. Stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So off camera I've just finished those edges and given that a little bit of a press. So now I'm ready to complete my neckline. So in preparation for that, I brought my lining up to the same stage as my outer fabric. So I've joined my 2 back pieces, I've gathered up those front pieces at the bottom curve and joined those at the shoulder seams. I've also ran that same stay stitching along the neckline, and here I'm just laying my lining over my outer, right sides together and pinning. and ready to stitch. So starting at the waist, stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, and when I come to the V at the back, I'm taking it nice and gently. I want to make sure that last stitch before I pivot is right on that center back, pivoting and up the other side, back stitching again at the waist. So that's how that looks. So as usual, off camera, I finished that edge and just snipped into that center back seam. That will help me out when I come to turn the whole thing right side out. So to finish the neckline completely, I just need to understitch. And in preparation for that, I need to press the seam allowance underneath towards the lining, which is what I'm doing here. And once it's all pressed, ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, stitching directly through the lining and the seam allowance underneath, just about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the outer fabric. Back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So again, off camera, I've given the whole thing a nice press, and that's my neckline complete. So now I'm ready to close up my armholes. So to do that, I'm using the burrito method. So currently, my lining and outer fabric are wrong sides together. I need them to be right sides together in order to stitch them. So all I'm doing here is rolling up one side of the bodice, setting it on top of the other shoulder, lifting up my lining fabric, flipping the outer fabric out underneath, and then laying my lining fabric over my outer fabric. So they are now right sides together and ready to pin. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to that 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way around, back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So off camera, I've just finished that edge, and now just pull my little roll from the inside. And once it's had a good press, this is how it looks. So that's one armhole complete. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the second side. So just rolling up one side of the bodice, placing it on top of the shoulder of the other side, lifting my outer fabric, flipping my lining fabric in underneath, laying my outer fabric over my lining, and ready to pin. So off camera, I've just pinned, stitched and finished off that edge, just in the same way as I did the first side, and here just pulling through my little roll. And after a good press, my bodice is almost complete. So I just need to take care of my side seams. So just opening up the lining and outer fabric, lining those up at the side seams, and pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitching at the end. So that's my side seams done. So off camera, I finished off that edge and given it a nice press. And this is how it looks. Super neat and tidy. So the very last thing I have to do is just run a line of tacking stitches across the bottom edge. Back stitching at the start, sewing within my seam allowance here, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. And all I'm doing here is joining my outer fabric to the lining fabric. That will help me out when I come to place the waist pieces later on. So that's how that looks. So that's my bodice complete. So I'm going to set that aside and work on the skirt. So this is one side of my skirt front. And just like the bodice, I have a couple of notches at the waist where I want to gather down this fabric. So just in the same way as I did the bodice, I'm just finishing my second line of stitches, pulling my threads at the end, and ready to gather down. Checking it with the waist here to make sure everything lines up. it does. So I've tied off my threads and I'm just pressing those gathers a little bit flatter. That will help me out when I come to place this on the waist a little bit later on. So setting my skirt front to the side for a second to work on the back. And I have the same couple of notches at the back as I did on the front. So running those same 2 gathering lines in between those notches. So that's both of those done. Lining it up with my waist, making sure everything fits. Pressing. So that's my back and front skirt all prepped, ready for the side seams. So laying my front over my back at the side seam, pinning and ready to sew. Back stitching at the start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And back stitching at the end. And of course I do the same on the other side. So I just need to finish off that edge. So you can see I've went ahead and done that here and given it a nice press. I've also brought my skirt lining up to the same stage as my skirt outer. So I have the same gathers in my back skirt and front. My side seams all sewn up and everything nicely pressed. So now I'm ready for my waist pieces. So I'm just laying my back over my front, right sides together and pinning those side seams. Ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching at the end. So that's that done. So I've went ahead and done exactly the same thing on my lining. I finished my edges on both my outer and my lining and given them both a nice press. Ready to attach to my skirt. So laying my waist piece right sides together with my skirt, matching up my side seams, centre fronts and centre back and pinning. Doing exactly the same thing on the lining and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, and I only show the outer fabric here. Of course I do exactly the same thing on the lining and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. I finished off my edges and given it a nice press. And while I was there, I pressed up my hem. So I've chosen to do a double folded hem here. So I folded my hem by about half of my seam allowance, pressed, folded again and pressed, and ready to stitch. So stitching right along that inner crease edge, using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way across, and back stitching at the end, and that's how that looks. So that's my hem all nicely in place, ready for a press, which I've went ahead and done off camera. I've done exactly the same thing to my lining. So now before I join my skirt to my bodice, I need to add some sort of a closure down the centre front. So I've chosen button loops and elastic cord cut to about a couple of inches wide to create those loops. And to give the loops a little bit of stability, I've just cut myself a bit of the lining fabric. I ran a little bit of interfacing in the centre, and then I've marked at intervals of about 1.5 inches or so, and I'm just going to hand stitch each little piece of elastic cord at those marked intervals. So I'm running a couple of stitches along the bottom, along the centre, and along the top, anchoring those stitches at the back, and ready to sew on the machine. So I'm just going to run a zigzag stitch right over the top of the cord. So I'm not actually piercing the cord here with my needle, I'm just encasing it with thread. So that's how the first side looks. So I'm going to hand stitch the second side in exactly the same way. So I've done that off camera, and now just running that same zigzag stitch just over the top of that second piece of cord, creating the loop. So this, coupled with the hand stitches, is going to give me a really strong button loop. So now just another 18 to do. So I've spared you guys that detail and finished that off camera, and this is how it looks. And for my buttons themselves, these are self-covered just with the outer fabric. And then the last thing to complete my button closure is a little modesty strip. So this is just a strip of the lining fabric again. I've pressed it along its length, ran a little bit of interfacing along one side, and now it's ready to attach to my skirt. So firstly, I'm going to put my loops on. So I'm just lining up the edge of that stabilizing fabric with the edge of my skirt front, pinning, and ready to stitch. So I'm stitching here within my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And when the needle pierces this cord, it can cause some uneven stitches. So what I'm trying to do here is go really gently across the top of the cord, back stitching at the start and the end, so that's my button loops attached. I love how this looks. And now to do exactly the same thing with the modesty strip. So just lining up the edge of the strip with the edge of the skirt front, pinning, and ready to stitch. So stitching again within my seam allowance, back stitching at the start, back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So that's my button loops and modesty strip in place. So now I'm ready to attach my skirt to my bodice at the waist. So just laying my bodice over my skirt, right sides together, lining up the centre back, the side seams, and the centre front, making sure when I'm pinning the centre fronts that I'm not pinning through either my button loops or my modesty strip. And ready to sew. So stitching here just within my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, back stitching at the end, so that's how that looks. And now I'm ready to attach my lining. So doing exactly the same thing here again. So I folded my bodice on top of my skirt, exposing that seam that I've just sewn, laying my lining right sides with that seam, pinning, and ready to sew. And this time I'm stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. That will hide the row of stitches that you've just seen me sew and keep everything nice and neat. Back stitching at the start and back stitching at the end. And now I just need to clean up that seam allowance on the overlocker and give it a press. And once done, this is how it looks. And from the outside, super neat and tidy. Love this. So now that my lining's attached, I'm ready to close up my centre front. So I'm just separating my lining from my outer fabric, placing it right sides together, sandwiching in between my bodice and my modesty strip, and pinning. And I've done exactly the same thing for the button loops, so you can see that here, and ready to sew. So stitching this time at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, trying to make sure that I'm sticking exactly, or as exactly as I can be, to my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down. That will make sure that my loops are all evenly exposed on the outside, and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. And exactly the same thing for the modesty strip. backstitching at the start and backstitching at the end. So that's that done. And once my edges have been cleaned up and it's been given a nice press, this is how it looks. I'm super happy with how this has turned out. So you can see here, I've ran that edge through the overlocker and pressed it towards the lining in preparation for my next step, which is understitching. So stitching here in exactly the same way as I did the bodice neckline. So that seam allowance is pressed towards my lining. I'm sewing directly through the lining and that seam allowance in underneath, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, backstitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. Exactly the same thing on the other side. So that's how that looks. And once it's been given a good press, this is how the whole thing looks. I love how this has turned out. So I only have one more thing to do before this dress is complete, and that is to pop on those self-covered buttons. So I've just hand stitched those in place off camera, and with that, this little dress is complete. So I've got my loops in place, those gorgeous buttons the whole way down the centre front. I've got my lining in place, that gorgeous V at the back with a nice border around the waist, gathers at the centre back, and this is how it looks on. So I could not be happier with how this has turned out. Those buttons and button loops I've wanted to try for ages, and I absolutely love them. The fit is so nice. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous summer dress in a beautiful border print design.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!